So, good afternoon, everyone. We come to the last event of the conference, and surely one of the most important ones. It's a huge pleasure to introduce Professor Dusa McDuff, to have her here as originally from Edinburgh, and from Edinburgh become a world-leading expert in synthetic anthropology. I think anything else I could say with reading that, I think she's best to go now and explain. So, thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. This is somewhat of an experimental talk, because I've never given a talk like this before. What I hope to do is to talk for about 50 minutes or so, or I don't know quite how long it's going to last, but I would very much welcome questions at the end, or questions in the middle if you'd like to. Now, Atiyah actually set up my talk incredibly well, because he, at the end of his talk, he talked about three women mathematicians, one of whom was Philippa Fawcett, that you may remember was this, she was a young woman who in 1890 became above the senior wrangler in the tripos examinations in Cambridge. And it was a time when actually women were allowed to sit exams, but of course they couldn't get degrees, and they were not allowed to be ranked. But this was amazing, because, you know, in the 19th century, people thought really, there were serious academics who were saying that women's brains were smaller than men's brains, and that, you know, the uterus made women very hysterical and they couldn't do mathematics. I mean, there were serious scientific arguments why women couldn't do mathematics at all. And then here was somebody who was above the senior wrangler, and that was sort of became very well known. Of course, she couldn't really have a career in mathematics. That was not possible. But she did have a career in education. So she became, you know, she contributed to math education, which of course was always very respectable for women to do that. At least it was certainly more respectable than being a mathematician. So the next person Atiyah mentioned was Grace Chisholm, who in 1895 was the first woman to get a PhD of any kind in Germany. She got a PhD in maths in Germany with Felix Klein, as far as I remember. And she actually did manage to have a career, and she managed to have a career by marrying a mathematician, and they worked, well, she lived in Switzerland, presumably he did too, because they had 6 children. I looked up on Wikipedia, and it was just, she was in Switzerland. But anyway, they wrote papers together quite a bit, and they were published mostly under, actually entirely, I think, under her husband's name, but at least she was a working mathematician who contributed to things. And then, well, he didn't mention, but, you know, some person he should have mentioned was Dame Mary Cartwright, who was a very distinguished mathematician in Cambridge, and she became an FRS in 1947. She was the first female mathematician to become a Fellow of the Royal Society. She worked and flourished in Cambridge, worked with Littlewood, and, you know, I was in Cambridge. When I was in Cambridge, she was mistress of Girton. I met her, actually, because I had this interview. Everybody, all the applicants to Cambridge had an interview with the mistress, and she was serving tea. And I didn't really appreciate women that's, you know, this elegant sort of tea kind of thing at that time. So she didn't say anything about mathematics to me as far as I remember. And then when I was in Cambridge later, she was away. So I never really met her as a mathematician. Though, I mean, I know she was a very brilliant mathematician. But, you know, what I wanted to say about this is that, you know, the other person that Atiyah mentioned with me, and I became an FRS in 1994. And actually, Atiyah was the one, he was the president. He shook my hand. He was the president at the time. And he told me when I got my FRS, you got a special clap, he said, you know, very, very restrained. But what I want to point out is that in between that time, there were no women mathematicians. I mean, there certainly were women in other subjects, but there were no women mathematicians became our FRS. So I was the second one. And that's really surprising if you think about it, because during this time, certainly lots of very talented women. I mean, I don't believe I was a uniquely talented woman after Mary Cartwright to actually manage to make a successful career. I mean, sorry, to have the potential to make a successful career. I think I may have been the one who managed. But the question is, how did I manage? And what happened to all the others? Because there clearly were lots of other talented women. Now, women of my generation, I was born in 1945. I'll give you write down sort of brief history later on. I was born in 45. Women in my generation, actually my friends, you see, most people, when they see a woman who's a mathematician, they don't want to know. They just sort of shy away. I'm sure you've all had, all of you of all sexes, people say, what do you do? And you say, you do mathematics. And they say, you are never very good at that. And you sort of say something else, right? I mean, that's completely common for everybody. But for women, it's a little bit more, because women, you know, biology is a sort of life science. When I was growing up, it would be okay if I wanted to be a biologist. Because at that time, it was thought of as a life science, and women give life, and it was sort of okay. But mathematics was a hard science, and it was just intrinsically unfeminine. And women did not do mathematics. And so that was one big hurdle. And a lot of the women who I have as friends now, and they do other things, they're professors of English or professors of history or something, they said they always liked maths when they were young, but they were just completely discouraged. I mean, they were quite good at it, but nobody said, encouragement at all. So that was the beginning, just complete blanket discouragement. But then there were a lot of people who got a little further than that. But it was obviously hard, because I don't really understand why there weren't more people. Now, one of the things I want to say is that, I was born in 45, and I came from a rather unusual family that I'll tell you more about later. But my mother had a job. She had an independent career. She was an architect. And she was actually an architect here in the civil service. There were one or two women in the civil service, not married women, tended to be not married women that had jobs. She was an independent, she was an architect, put a lot of focus on her career, and was very brilliant. But one of the things is, one of the problems with her attitude, you'd think that, I was always brought up to think I'd have a career, so I was way ahead of everybody in my generation. Because in my generation, mothers typically were married and sort of looking after the house, and that's what the daughters were expected to do, and then the daughters could break away from that. They sort of got together in the 70s, all these women's groups, and they were sort of discussing about how they'd be independent. But you see, I started from a different point, because I always expected to have a career. And so that was a big advantage to me, because I didn't have to fight that battle. On the other hand, there was a problem that she was very much in awe of my father. Well, of my father's abilities. My father, and we'll have to say more about this. My father was a very brilliant man, so there's no reason why people wouldn't be in awe of his abilities. He was actually Professor Waddington, and there's a Waddington building. I just went to see it. It was just round the corner. He was a professor here, and we knew Michael Swan. He was a friend of my father's, and this is the Swan building. But he was more than just a scientist. He was a very far-sighted thinker. And a lot of his ideas were sort of before their time. He wanted his theoretical biology. He was interested in development, and sort of genetics and development. He had a lot of ideas which now, with genetic engineering, people can actually make a reality. So he was a very far-sighted kind of person. So he was a far-sighted scientist, biologist, really, sort of doing evolution. But he was a polymath. He was interested in philosophy. He was interested in art. He was interested in science and society. He was very, very engaged in many things. And so as far as philosophy goes, he wrote this book called The Ethical Animal, which was like in, I don't know, it must have been, because when I was, the beginning of the 60s, he was corresponding with Teilhard de Chardin and various people, and really trying to develop a Darwinian theory of ethics, how through, because he was obviously a rationalist, but sort of how through evolution did people have an ethical sense, and what would it mean? So that's the kind of thing you read books about now. But he was writing a book about this in the 1960s. I mean, it was not the only one, there was a whole bunch of people. But anyway, he showed me, he gave me books to read on philosophy, and we discussed that book when I was 13 or something. I remember having long discussions with him. He was a very brilliant guy, my father. Actually, perhaps this is a good time to show his picture, which is the first picture. Here, that's my father. But you see, as a father, I mean, there was one problem. As a father, he wasn't very interested in children. So he wasn't, it wasn't like I was daddy's little girl or something. I mean, that's a thing you might be. You might be daddy's little girl, daddy sees you're very brilliant and then sort of mentors you. But there was something not that. And then he didn't like math. That was another problem. He thought mathematics was very boring. And he would tell me about that, Partly the reason I became a mathematician was, I mean, one of the things is that in the beginning of the 60s, there were these crises, these world crises, like the Berlin Wall crisis, and then there was the Cuban crisis, but in fact the Berlin Wall crisis was closer to me, and I really thought the world was going to end in about a week. And I was alone at home, my parents weren't there. I seriously thought, there was going to be atomic war. And that sort of made me rethink a lot of things. All this rationalist, scientific point of view about progress and whatever, what had it brought me but a bomb? And one of the things about mathematics was that I thought it was completely useless. It was not, it was an art. I saw mathematics as an art rather than a science. And then the other thing is that I was brought up in a girls' school and we didn't have any good science teaching. So I had no idea what physics and, really I had very little idea of what biology or chemistry might be. And physics, well, I despised the physics teacher. And mathematics, though, I had a really good teacher. So I was very lucky. I had this wonderful maths teacher who could explain things to me and really understood mathematics. And so that was something that I could resonate with. And then, mathematics, I thought, I mean, obviously there was a lot of mathematics in building the bomb, but that was sort of physics, that one didn't count. So the kind of math, artistic kind of approach to math that I liked, would not build a bomb. So that was a reason. But my father thought it was very dry and boring, so he didn't encourage me that way particularly. And then there was another thing that I want to say. There's a very distorted image of women. And, which I think is, there's been many distorted images of women, and actually I'm talking about myself as a woman, but those of you who are in some other minority group, like if you've got darker skin or whatever, there's distorted images of people like that, and it really is very damaging. Anyway, I'm talking about distorted images of women. And of course there's the image, the idea that their brains are too small, they can't think, which was a serious idea. There's an idea that it's just not in their nature to think carefully. That's another idea. Now, there were men, of course, who were interested in promoting women, and my father was one of them. He had a lot of women in his lab, a lot of very talented women in his lab. But one of the things is, at that time, I mean, a long time, you'll see there's a whole history of this, which I'll go into a little later. One of the ways that women would encourage women is, men would encourage women. Men were typically a little older, they were leading figures, and then there were these brilliant, charming women who were very talented, and they thought of them as sort of their mistresses, their potential wives. There was a lot of, it was not seen as equal. And so my father had a lot of women in his lab, but they either were his mistresses, or they were potential mistresses, or they sort of negotiated that in some way. I mean, they were not all his mistresses, obviously. And I'm not saying that all the people who encourage women were like that, but there was a large fraction of it. So, one of the things that happened to the young women the bright young women, they would be brilliant, and they'd meet their professors, and they'd fall in love with their professors, who were delighted to be fell in love with, and then they would sort of, get married and sort of be detrapped somehow. And, it's fine. I mean, nowadays, a lot of young men and young women in mathematics have relationships. That's fine. But you have to have a more equal kind of relationship. And if you have a professor or somebody who's more senior and a younger person, it's very hard to have an equal relationship. And it's very hard then for the young person to build an independent career. So that's a difficulty. I think that's one of the ways that a lot of people sort of got detrapped. And anyway, that didn't help. I was my father's daughter. I was not interested in, that just, his attitude to women didn't really quite help in some sense. And by the time I got old enough for him to notice me, I think I'd been sort of turned off and I didn't talk to him. That was the way I dealt with a lot of these things. I simply didn't talk to people. So I just didn't talk to him. So we didn't have, at a time when he might have actually given me some good advice, and he suddenly gave my sister good advice, I was simply not talking to him. Which is some sort of protective thing. Anyway, that's a sort of general background. So I thought the next thing I'd do is so that you don't get completely lost. It is about my life. I'm sorry about this, but that was the title, right? So anyway, it's inevitably somewhat. But I was born in London, just after the war. In 1947, I came to Edinburgh, and that was because my father he was being mobbed. He worked in Blackett's lab during the war, and war work, important war work, sort of, founding operations research, hunting for the U-boat. A lot of scientists helped in the war effort, and he helped that one. Anyway, he was being mobbed, and he got a professorship in Edinburgh, so he came to Edinburgh, and we came to Edinburgh, and we lived in Morton Hall. I'll say a little bit more about that. I had a girls' school. And then in 62 to 67, I was an undergraduate in Edinburgh. And that's partly because I refused a professorship. Refused a scholarship to Cambridge. Then from 67 to 70, I was a PhD in Cambridge. And I went 1969 to 70 to Moscow for 6 months. Then from 70 to 72, I was a postdoc in Cambridge. From 72 to 76, I was a lecturer at York. And during that time, I actually spent 1974 to 75 at MIT. They had a visiting professorship for women. 76 to 78, I was in Warwick. And then 78 to 2007, a long stretch, 7 or 8, depends how you count it, I was at Stony Brook. And then I moved to Barnard College, which is part of Columbia. It's a women's college in part of Columbia, which is where I am at the moment. So that's a sort of brief outline of things, and I will be showing you some pictures and sort of slotting them in. I thought it might be a good idea to put some sidelines in here. So during this time, I had 2 children. I had one child here, 1971, and I had another child in 1984. So these are children. And then another thing that happened, sort of mathematical things that happened. So I had a good maths teacher here. My PhD, well, I was totally lucky with my PhD. I wrote a very good PhD, which was published in the Annals of Mathematics. I can't remember, perhaps in 1969. Anyway, I sort of quickly solved a problem which was well known, and I had my PhD published in the Annals, which was very lucky, because I then went through a long period where I'll tell you more, that I wasn't doing very much, but at least it made me feel I could do mathematics, because, you know, that's some kind of certification. Now, well, there were various things. I mean, in Moscow I met Gelfand. I'll tell you about him. And then, the period I was in York, I was working with Siegel. But you know, one of the things is that I think I matured as a mathematician. A lot of things happened around 84. So in 83, I moved to symplectic topology, which is what I do now. And a lot of things were happening at that time. And I sort of started developing, and sort of in 87, I wrote a decent paper again. Actually, I wrote another decent paper while I was here. With Siegel, I did some good ones. But I wrote a paper on my own in 87. I mean, I was beginning, you know, sort of becoming more independent. So I wrote a reasonably good paper there. And then, you know, it wasn't until 1995, where I was with Lalonde, I wrote a paper that was published in the Annals. And by the time I'd done that, I thought, well, at last, I've achieved a massive, you know, sort of got to where I got to be. I mean, there was my thesis there, long, long period of whatever. And of course, you know, that's a bad measure, but somehow I took that as a measure that I'd sort of done okay. And then, well, I was at Sunnybrook for a long time, and any of you who are faculty members, or, you know, there's a lot, you get involved in a whole lot of things, undergraduate education, you know, running a department, many, many issues that take your time away. And actually moving to Barnard was very good from that point of view, because I have rather few duties at Barnard, and I'm in New York City, it's very exciting. And I spent a lot of time working, and I wrote another good paper that was published in the Annals. So that's my third. So that's with Schlenk. There's another. I mean, that's not the only judge, but, you know, that's just saying, you know, I feel I've done some good work if it gets published there. So I can feel happy with it. So anyway, that's a sort of brief thing. Now, I was going to go through some slides and tell you a little bit more backstory. Okay, so there's my father. So the next person I have up here.
If you that blackboard should go down.
Oh, this blackboard. Well, I thought it might be helpful. People to see this right now. It might be helpful for people to see the thing. I think they can look over there. Anyway, this is my grandfather, who is a very interesting guy. He was a junior wrangler. He was a junior wrangler in 1904, which was this, and the senior wrangler at that time was Eddington, so it was a pretty distinguished kind of person. My grandfather, but that's probably where I inherited some mathematical talent from, because I don't think it was on my father's side of the family. They were farmers and various, I mean, they were obviously had fine intellects, but they weren't particularly mathematical. He came from a family of lawyers. There's quite a lot of story about him, but let me just say, he fought, I mean, this side of the family, they were pretty left-wing, and he, as a matter of principle, fought as a private in the First World War, and was an artillery person, and so he was, you know, dragging these guns around the battlefield, the trench at the front, and calculating trajectories. I mean, perhaps he, you know, and finding out how, that's what they had to do. They didn't have computers those days. They had to calculate, where do they put this, what's the right angle to get the other side. So he was fighting as a private in the artillery. He was very magnanimous. He was an amazing person. He ran for Parliament unsuccessfully in the Labour constituency. And he was my mother's, I mean, he sort of was, because my grandmother didn't have too much time for my mother, but he had a lot of time for my mother, so he was her, sort of mentored my mother. Okay, so that's him. And then this is a very interesting portrait of 4 generations of the Pembrokes. This is sort of where things come from. So, in many ways, Maud, who's the one on the left, was a remarkable woman. She was born in 1865. I think she was born in New Zealand. The family at that time was in New Zealand. And she was one of the, I mean, they were a political family. They were ministers in the government. I think she married a journalist. Anyway, she was one of the women who was among the feminists who got the New Zealand women got the vote in 1893, before anyone else in the sort of Western world. 1893, that's pretty early for women to get the vote. She was one of the people who organised that. She later on wrote a book in 1912. They moved to Britain. Her husband was Agent General for New Zealand, I think. And they were prominent in the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society was sort of a precursor of the Labour Party. The Labour Party came out of it. And the Webbs, you may have heard of Sidney and Beatrice Webb, were part of that. And Shaw, H.G. Wells, a lot of people were part of it. And she wrote a book with some Fabian women. She went and visited the people at East End, the working poor of East End. Wrote a book called Round About a Pound a Week, which is about the lives of working class people. Well, the choices that the mothers had to make when they had 20 shillings to spend. And did they spend it on more food for the man who was a wage earner? Did they spend it on better living quarters, which were less damp, so that they could, there would be less danger to their health? The whole point of this book was to A, say these people were people, and B, to say they were rational people. They were actually making the best choices they could under impossible circumstances. There was an attitude, oh, well, they're just spendthrift, they're just, they're the poor, you don't need to think about them. This book, I still earn royalties from it. It's quite amazing. It's been reprinted, it's used as textbooks, and we have lawyers in the family, so I still have the copyright for this book. Quite amazing. Okay, so that's her. And then the next one in the middle was a child, Anna Jane. It's amazing to get all these together, you see, because that's the one on the right is my great-grandmother, Mrs. Robinson. I know very little about her. But you see, the child in the middle, Anna Jane, was illegitimate. And to get them all together in a photograph, I think is quite remarkable. And you can see from their expressions, they're not too happy to be all together. Anyway, in the middle one, Amber, was a very brilliant young woman, and she went to Girton. And she was one of the brilliant young Fabians. She got she didn't get a degree, but she read moral philosophy. She couldn't get a degree. But they were all Fabians, and she was a member of the young Fabians. And she, H.G. Wells was one of these roving men who, he was a brilliant man, H.G. Wells. I don't have a picture of him. He's very imaginative, wrote lots of things, self-made person, very, very good ideas. And he thought the Fabians were all old fogies, which they surely were. And, he was sort of very attracted to young women. Anyway, he had an affair, a renowned affair with my grandmother. And the story is that, he suddenly called her Dusa, which is my name, and I'm called after her, that. Now this name, the question is where that name comes from. This name comes from Medusa. But the question is whether it was his name for her because she had long, snaky black hair and she was Medusa, or it was her own name that she picked out for herself. Now, H.G. Wells said it was her own name that she picked out for herself, and I much prefer that version of the story. So let's say, that's not what I was told as a young person, but anyway, let's say that's the right story. She saw this sculpture with Perseus holding up Medusa's head, and just sort of wanted to be this very strong female presence, and took that name for herself. I don't know how she got the name, but anyway, she got that name. And they had a very renowned affair, especially renowned. They ran away to France together. She got pregnant, I suppose, first. Then they ran away to France together. Then she realized, A, she couldn't cook. B, they had no interest in living in the north of France. H.G. Wells wanted to live in London. They couldn't survive, right? So they had to come back. And then my grandfather sort of rescued Amber and married her, and then she became she was a very honourable woman. She did lots of things in her life, but she didn't you might say she didn't have an independent career. It's very hard for women to have an independent career. So people said, so she wrote several books, she taught, she did many things, but somehow the attitude in our family was she never quite lived up to her promise. It was a very funny attitude. A, she didn't live up to her promise. B, H.G. Wells' behaviour went completely unquestioned. H.G. Wells was very brilliant, and women in my family, like my mother, they looked up to these brilliant men, like my father. And, I was called Dusa with no sense of criticism. I was meant to think this. So when I grew up, I obviously thought I had to do what Amber did. I had to run away with H.G. I had to do the equivalent of running away with H.G. The only way to now, it was only to hold my head up as a person. I had to do that. Which was sort of ridiculous, right? But there was no, we were a very funny family in the sense that we were very idealistic and had no sense of, I certainly had no practical sense whatsoever. And you just thought you'd manage, we managed. So. Anyway, that's the story of that picture, that photo. So then, what have we got next? Oh, there's my mother. So I've got these rather interesting pictures of my mother and my sister. She was a very brilliant young woman. She's actually a very good architect, but it's very hard to make your life as women. It's still very hard for women in architecture. And then, if you didn't marry an architect, it was very hard for you to make a career. She did build some buildings, and then she had a very honourable career, I would say, in the Edinburgh Civil Service. She built apartments for, it was the time they were building council housing. And so she built council housing and really tried to make sure that the council housing were of good quality, and that even though it was for working class people, they were good to live in, they were, all the amenities she would have wanted, given the constraints of what money she had to spend. But, she was she did a lot of good things. Anyway, here she is, somewhere in the 30s, with her stick, a young woman, and perhaps daring clothes because she's wearing trousers. I'm not sure how much people wear trousers at home. So that's her. And then here's my sister, also with a stick. Because my feeling is that if you want to succeed, and you were born when we were born, you had to be pretty determined. So you needed a good, strong stance to do it. Now, she was she was the one, I was the sort of brilliant one of the family, and she was the one who was more social and sort of interested in languages. And so my mother sent her to France to learn languages. That was another way a woman could be. But she's a dame in her own right, dame professor. She was a professor at Cambridge University. She founded a Mongolian studies unit. She knows Mongolian, she knows Tibetan, she knows Russian, she knows probably a little bit of Buryat, or certainly quite a bit of Buryat, which is related to Mongolian. She's an anthropologist. She knows lots of languages. She's very learned. She suddenly made use of her language ability. Anyway, that's my sister. With her stick. And I want to tell you why I sort of like these sticks, is because my parents knew Margaret Mead, because my father in the 30s, actually the way he became into biology was through William Bateson. And William Bateson, who was a biologist, and William Bateson's son was Gregory Bateson. Some of you may have known. Gregory Bateson became this sort of guru about the double bond. Anyway, Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead in the 30s were very sort of with it intellectuals. Margaret Mead was an anthropologist, of course. And so she visited, my parents continue to know her, and she visited the family once and sort of strode into our kitchen with her stick, because she was getting on in years and she really needed the stick to get around. And my father, talking about her later, said, well, she was too much for any man. And I thought that was a very good thing to be. Later on, not necessarily when he said it, but later on, I just like the image of women with their sticks and they're too much for any man. That's what you need to be. You need to, not all the time, but, you need to have some independence. And it took me a long time to achieve that independence. And wherever you are, you may be another woman, you may be somebody else, you still need to have independence from whoever it is that you admire so much. Because there are brilliant people that you come under their spell and you think they're fabulous, and you couldn't possibly be like that. Well, perhaps you can't, but you can be yourself. And you know, you need to have a sort of independence, and it's not so easy to get that. Anyway, there's my sister with her stick. So there's me. So I'm going to have a few pictures of me as a young girl. I was in Edinburgh. I was a very eager beaver little girl. I used to love doing sums. I used to love pleasing people. And, you know, I just liked that kind of thing. My grandfather, when I was perhaps a tiny bit older than this, showed me the mathematical, the multiplication tables. I was somewhat precocious in arithmetic. And so, you know, at age 4, I knew how to do multiplications up to 9 times 9. And he wrote them down on this tablet and showed me all the symmetries of those things. He showed me how the 9 times table, it starts 9, 18, 27, 36. And, you know, as one number goes up, the other number goes down. He just showed me, and it was a symmetric thing. He showed me all this. I thought it was wonderful. That's a sort of aesthetic part of mathematics that you know, I always responded to that. And, you know, I love doing sums. Must have been a horrible younger sister to have. My sister's a little older than me. I don't think she really appreciated it. Here's us playing in Morton Hall. Morton Hall was a sort of stately house. It's outside Edinburgh now. Those of you who live here know about it. After the war, there was a great housing crunch, and so people, you know, actually everybody in my father's lab, or all the, you know, some of the faculty and some of the staff with their families came to live there. And it was a sort of, well, it was a communal arrangement. So the children ate in their own dining room. There were lots of servants because they were refugees, we ate in our own dining room, and the grown-ups ate in their own dining room. And that was fine for us, but I think a lot of families weren't so happy. Anyway, it was an idyll for the kids. The kids ran around, we had gangs, we climbed the trees, we had a wonderful time. I think the parents had a slightly more difficult time. Okay, so here's me, aged around 15. I don't know exactly what it is. Now the Piper stained glass, well, that's just, my mother was an architect and they knew the Pipers, and he was designing the glass for Coventry Cathedral at the time and gave my mother a sample of it. So we have this absolutely fabulous stained glass, which is actually in the, anyway, this is me there. I sort of like that picture, but that was about the time when I realized that sort of beginning adolescence, and I realized I wanted to be everything. I wanted to be a mathematician, I wanted to be, run away with H.G. Wells. I just wanted everything. What can I say? The next one. So this is David and me. Now David was sort of my equivalent of H.G. Wells. He was a young guy. We met through music, because I played music. And he was very interested in languages and poetry. And so I found him unbelievably attractive. And we were very lucky. We were very free. So I was age 16 at this point. We were allowed to go to spend 2 weeks on our own in youth hostel in Denmark. So we had a wonderful time. Somebody else must have taken this picture. Anyway, that is, so the next picture, well, what's the next picture? That gets to be in Moscow. So what happened was that my sister got interested in language. She was the one who introduced us to Russia. She went to Russia for musical purposes, actually. Anyway, she went to Russia, and then we went, and then David got interested in Russian. And he then wanted to do a PhD in Russian literature. And I went to Cambridge. You know, my idea was that I could support the family doing mathematics, and he would write poetry. That was my idea. I liked that. Anyway, he was doing this, he had to go to PhD. So I managed to get to Moscow. Now this was after you see, I did my PhD in Cambridge, but the interesting thing about that was that after I'd finished, even though I'd done this good PhD, I essentially knew no mathematics. I was incredibly narrow. I wrote a PhD in von Neumann algebra, kind of C-star algebra, sort of soft functional analysis. But I didn't know anything about the broader. I knew nothing. And I went to Moscow, and I was asked, who should I study with? And because in Edinburgh, I'd actually studied a bit of distribution theory under Adele with Gelfand. I knew Gelfand's name, and I said Gelfand. So that was an incredibly lucky choice, because he is a totally brilliant guy, and there was a wonderful mathematical scene in Moscow in those days. So there were many, many seminars. He knew everything. I mean, well, if he didn't know everything, he suddenly thought he knew most of everything. But he would explain it to me. I mean, this is him at the seminar. I gave a seminar, and I said a few things, and then he translated, which meant I said one sentence, and he said 3 sentences. And then I said 1 sentence, and he said 3 sentences. It worked out quite well. And then, we'd meet, and he would just tell me about a whole lot of mathematics. And I started, you see, he gave me this paper to read called The Lie Algebra of Vector Fields. The cohomology of the Lie algebra of vector fields on a manifold, that's what it was. And I'd never heard of cohomology. I didn't know what a Lie algebra was. I'd never heard of a vector field, and I didn't know what a manifold was, right? I told you I was ignorant. So I had to set about learning this, right? So I was only there for 6 months. He was an incredible inspiration. And he would write me postcards, because he couldn't get out of the country. He would write me postcards every so often, just sending me his best wishes. I mean, he did what he could. So this is actually, so I went back to Cambridge, where I was doing this postdoc. And that's actually where I met Andrew, because Andrew was a topologist, and I was trying to do topology at that time. Andrew was one of the few people that I could really speak to, because he could communicate with David also, because David sort of was interested in Russian literature, and Andrew had a broad view. I mean, many mathematicians are very narrow. Anyway, so I met Andrew at that time. I was very, very isolated. I didn't really talk to anybody much about mathematics. I did have a child, so I had a child to look after. I was busy reading all these books that I, hadn't read before. And this is a picture of me slightly later on with Anna. So that's my daughter. Then here's Graham. So the other thing what sort of rescued me as far as mathematics goes is that I met Graham. Actually, Andrew said he introduced me to Graham. And and he gave me a research problem to work on. So he was the one, I essentially did a second PhD with him, and we worked together fruitfully for quite a long time. I mean, he also had a good vision. The only difficulty was a question of independence. At some point, I had to not do things with him, I had to be independent. So we sort of, moved on a bit. There's me in Toronto. So, one of the things that happened when I was in New York, so, there was a long period here where I'd say I didn't, I really did nothing as a postdoc as far as sort of explicit mathematics. New York was a great liberation, because I went there and found that actually I knew something. As I in Cambridge, all these big intellects walking around who knew everything, and I knew nothing. And then, which I found later on is quite a common experience, actually. I talked to the president of somebody who was the president of the LMS, and I said, well, when I was in Cambridge, I always felt I knew nothing. For years I felt I knew nothing. And he said, well, so did I. And, it's common. I think the PhD was just too narrow, so you didn't get a good basis. And if you wanted to go out onto the world stage, you have to do a huge amount of education, which is, one hopes is slightly easier for you these days, but it's still something you have to do, to learn, to get a basis. Anyway, because of Gelfand, I'm sure it was because of Gelfand, who knew Singer, I was recommended for this place at MIT. They were trying to encourage women at that time. So there was an assistant professorship, a visiting assistant professorship that they'd set aside for women. And I was invited to go. So that was a huge opportunity. And there's me, and I was then invited to go to Toronto to give a talk. That's me there, where I was sort of feeling successful, feeling acknowledged. I mean, I was not feeling like that most of the time, but here was one nice photograph where I really did feel like that. And that was a big opportunity. I mean, I think these kind of things are terribly important too, because people get lost, You have a child, you get buried in some kinds of things. It's very hard to come out and become a mathematician again, find the time. So I think these kind of fellowships are incredibly important. And then later on, well, this is much later. I then met Jack fairly soon after that, Jack Milner. And this is, of course, a recent photograph that Andrew gave me of me and Jack in Belgium, which is where we're going next week, actually. I hope it'll be sunny. We're going to have a holiday there. I had a second child. Here's Jack with Thomas. And then I ended up with a slide of the family, the whole family. It's mostly the Milner family, of all of us in Provincetown. But I think this is a good time to stop. Let me go back to perhaps some slightly more mathematical thing. About This is a favourite photograph of mine. And I'd like to answer any questions anybody might have. Nobody has any questions. Yeah, you have it.
You guys said that there was a large gap in human plus mathematicians that you had named. There was a large gap.
Right.
Where do you see the next step?
Well, I mean, certainly after, there've been people after me. I didn't sort of talk about what's happened since then. So there are several more women, women have been appointed to the roles of life. There's certainly more women in entering mathematics these days. And it's, I don't know so much about Britain because I've spent a lot of my mathematical life in America. In America, it's noticeable. There are very brilliant. Mathematicians come in all kinds. There are some excellent ones, and there are some brilliant ones, and there are some middling ones. There's a whole range but there's more of them, which I think is incredibly important, because I think it's very important. You see, I was always very isolated. I had very few friends, partly because especially women friends, I was very prejudiced against women, actually, because I didn't know anybody who really had the kind of ambitions I had. And, I could have got to know Mary Cartwright, but I didn't. And when I went to Cambridge, I was married. I became married to David quite soon after when I was in Cambridge. So I was basically married, and they had no provision for married students. And I was excluded from all the men's colleges because I was a woman. I was just not sort of, and then it was the 60s, there was a free university. It was not a time when you get close to institutions. But you see, it would be much better. It's much better if people have a cohort. If they have see, Atiyah, for example, he didn't find many people in Cambridge. He said, his inspiration, if you went to his talk, was clearly from France. And some of the other graduate students, and there were one or two good professors. But you need a group of people to sort of work with. And I got that when I moved into symplectic geometry, and the field was somehow developing, and a group of different people came in from different areas, and then I started collaborating with people. But these days I would hope as a postgraduate you get to, you make friends with some of you find common ground with some of your people in your degree program, and that's why I think this kind of thing is a very good meeting, because you have a chance to meet lots of other people. So if there's nobody actually in your university, with any luck, with somebody in some other university, you can build a network. Because I think you need a huge amount of encouragement to. Mathematics is not easy, and you need a lot of encouragement to stay in mathematics. You need to feel you have something, A, you get pleasure out of it, and B, there's something you have to contribute. Yeah?
Why did you refuse your scholarship to Cambridge?
Because you see, my sister had abandoned the boyfriend here and gone to Cambridge. That was considered by the boyfriend a bad thing to do. And we were in friends, it was sort of leaving. I met David at that time. He was at Edinburgh University. So although I did get the scholarship, in the end I didn't go, because it would have been thought of as a betrayal. And, these days actually, if you meet somebody you're very close to when you're young, there's some kind of understanding it might be better to go to separate places or mature a little bit and keep in contact. But we were not so, we didn't think of it in that language. It would have just been a betrayal. Yeah.
So, although you didn't have such an easy route into mathematics because you're a woman and it was more difficult in the past, it seems like, if not from an upper class family, you came from an intellectual family where at least those kind of opportunities were presented to you. Right, that was a huge advantage. So do you feel that, now people don't have to be, from those kind of backgrounds to go to university anymore, but do you think it's still harder, especially for, say, women from the working classes, do you think it's harder for them to get into?
I'm sure it's harder for everybody from the working, men and women. There have been lots of stories, though. There certainly were of a whole bunch of intellectuals who benefited from, I've forgotten what they were called, but there were education reforms in the mid-40s, sort of opening up the grammar schools to...
The Bachelor Act.
the Butler Act, right, opening up the grammar schools, Raymond Williams, I mean, a lot of it. So even though that's still hard to leave your class back, you know, to leave your family and whatever, women, it may be even harder, right? I think it's very important, therefore, to try and reach out to schools and have programs for bright school kids to make them realize that you can be a mathematician, or a scientist, or whatever. I mean, I think that kind of thing is very important. That's something that, you know, young people could do better, probably better than old people. Just sort of, I think at every stage it's important for people to reach out to the people at the stages coming up, you know, so that people can see a vision. Because I mean, you're right. I didn't really have an understanding of what it would be like to be a mathematician. Not for me to be a mathematician, but I did know it was a possibility. Yeah.
Could you say something about your perceptions of the difficulties that women had in the United States in contrast to Britain?
Well, I think the difficulties are probably much the same. But one of the interesting things is that a lot of the women who are successful in the States don't come from the States. They're immigrants.
Oh.
And one of the things I think is you go to a new country and all the things that you're aware of are in your country holding you back, all the expectations. You go to this new place, you don't notice them. There's no resonance. You know, I found going to America, it was a completely blank. I remember I first went into Harvard Square, and I sort of in Cambridge, and I looked around, and I couldn't see any structure. I couldn't read the buildings. They were all, it was foreign. I just thought it was all the same. You know, it was always like, well, it wasn't quite the same as Route 1, but it was, you know, you're just not aware of what are the expectations. And so I was never very good at reading other people's expectations anyway, but I think that it was sort of liberating to go to the States. And I think that many other women from Europe have found the same. So they've stayed and they've built a career in the States. You know, Italians, French. Perhaps French is slightly different, but Italians, Portuguese, whatever.
Don't you think that Native Americans, that is
Not, you mean actual people born in America? You know, in the American, I mean, it's very un-American to become a mathematician. I mean, there's a lot of Jewish mathematicians because they have a sort of tradition. But Jack Milner being sort of born in Maplewood, New Jersey, is quite unusual. Maple, I mean, you know, it's because America's just, you know, to success in America, you make money, you do things. You know, you're an engineer, you're a businessman, you're an entrepreneur. You're not a mathematician. You know, I mean, you might be a financier. And then so I don't think it's. I mean, there certainly are some women mathematicians. I mean, women mathematicians now. The ones who are from America, but a lot of them are not. And so perhaps the trouble is that Britain hasn't benefited from this immigration, right? I mean, I think it helps. When you go to a new society, you're just not aware so much of what people expect of you. You could be who you want.
Well, I don't know, when I came here, I thought the attitude toward women, this was 30 years ago, was antediluvian.
Well, I think
compared to the United States.
That may be possible, may be true. I mean, I haven't. Well, I just tried to ignore. You see, that's why I have very few friends. I tried to ignore a lot of things in here. I was always brought up ignoring my surroundings. I was an English person brought up in Scotland. So, you know, a lot of what was going around, that was all Scottish. I was English. Right? And, you know, I just didn't have the connections. And our family was very isolated, so we didn't know a lot of other families. So I wasn't brought up in a nice sort of group of people all with similar expectations. I was very much brought up on my own in some sort of ideal kind of situation. Doesn't mean to say, I mean, when I became more aware of these things, you see, I sort of went backwards. So when I was a teenager, you know, I married and I took my husband's name. McDuff is my married name. My mother kept she kept the name Blanco White for her professional purposes. I, of course, went the other way. You know how teenagers are. They do the other. And my mother had housekeepers and things, and I thought, well, that's bad, you know, you shouldn't do that. So I always did your own cooking. Now, the trouble with doing your own cooking is it's just a lot of work. You know, in the end, With David, I was doing absolutely everything. I was earning a living, I was driving the car, I was doing the shopping, I was taking the baby, I was doing everything. It's a lot of work. It's hard to find the time to have good mathematical thoughts, if that's what you do. Yeah. So that's why it took me, part of the reason it took me a long time, it was a long period when I wasn't actually producing much mathematics. So I was teaching, I was learning things, I was talking. Okay, perhaps that's...
So, yeah. So thank you very much.